One of the first chess openings that I learned to play with the black pieces was the King's Indian defense. And I've played quite a few games with the King's Indian at this point. And today's game is a pretty interesting example of kind of the style of the King's Indian and what black might be trying to play for, but also some interesting sort of practical challenges that white can present against the King's Indian player. So let's dive in and have a look. This is round 3 of the St. Mary's Open. If you haven't seen round 1 and 2 yet, I'll be linking to the playlist in the description here. And as you can see, I was paired against a pretty strong player, 1831, and my rating is 1683 at this point. And so he started off with d4, and I started with the King's Indian defense. It's my sort of go-to against d4. And I learned the King's Indian early because it's something you can play against a lot of different openings from white. Like you can play it against the English, you can play it against the bird opening, the ready. Sort of the one main exception is against e4. If you play knight f6 right away, then this is called the Alekhine opening. But you can actually still play a King's Indian-like opening with just by playing d6 first and then going into knight f6. And this is called the Peart's defense. I used to play this quite a bit against e4 as well. But it has a very similar setup. So the King's Indian, d4, knight f6, and then this is kind of the main line. What we do is we push g6, and then we fianchetto this bishop. And then the main ideas are we're going to castle kingside, and we're going to push d6. Particularly as soon as e4 is on the board, we're going to push d6. And then often we try for sort of a pretty early e5 push. And if we manage to lock the center up, then we're probably going to push f5. Even sometimes if the center doesn't lock, we're going to push f5 and probably try for sort of a kingside attack. And in a lot of King's Indian games, black ends up going for sort of a kingside attack, and white ends up expanding on the queen side. And the interesting thing is, as long as white has castled kingside, then black's attack can often be more powerful because you're actually directly attacking the king. On the other hand, your own king is usually castled on this side of the board, and so it's a little bit double-edged. If it doesn't work, then you could be weakening your king quite a bit. And we'll see some of that in this game. e4 on the board, so I played d6. And then that's sort of the main line up to here. But now this was a move that I hadn't seen before, and this is actually a pretty interesting one. So a common idea against the Peart's defense, which is the one where white starts with e4 and black plays d6. A lot of this setup is pretty similar, except usually the c pawn doesn't get pushed, so it ends up having a bit of a different flavor. Something that's pretty common, though, in the Peart's is this idea of putting the bishop on e3, putting the queen behind it. And I say e3, it could also come out to g5 as well. But then the idea is to bring the bishop down here, trade off the dark squared bishops, castle long, and then do kind of a pawn storm on this side of the board. That's a pretty common way to play against the Peart's defense. And it often doesn't work as well against the King's Indian. Usually in the King's Indian, we can get the knight onto this square pretty quickly and trade it off for the bishop if the bishop ever goes there. It's just not as common of an idea against the King's Indian, but that's exactly what my opponent was going for, preventing my knight from going to g4, and then you'll see wanting to line up on the dark squares and maybe start an attack on the king side. Which was pretty interesting. So I was pretty happy to have my experience with the Peart's defense as well, and kind of knowing how to handle this sort of attack. And basically what you do is, if you know that white is going to be expanding on this side of the board, then you want to end up expanding over here against their castled king, which again, I haven't done in the King's Indian before, but I assumed at this point that a similar idea would probably apply. So I castled anyway. Bishop e3, as I said, and then e5. Very common in the King's Indian to play e5. It's also common to play c5 instead, and I'm not really sure. It would have made for a different game. It might have been interesting to play c5 because then maybe it supports some expansion over on this side of the board. I'm just going to make sure I didn't move my browser window there. I think I might have. Whoops. There we go. Okay, everything's still lined up. Perfect. It can support some expansion on this side of the board. But I wasn't sure which way white was going to commit to castling yet. It looked like white was going to castle long, but they hadn't yet. So I didn't want to do any like premature expansion at this point. I probably still could have, but I just didn't want to. So I went ahead with my typical idea of the e5 push. d5 is quite typical, and now the center is locked. And as I mentioned, when the center is locked, we're probably going to try for some kingside expansion. But again, white isn't castled yet, so it's still a little bit unclear. But I went ahead with my typical ideas. I like to push a5, and the idea is I'm going to put a knight on a6 and then over to c5, because that's a nice place for the knight. It double attacks this pawn, so white has to handle that. And the reason for pushing a5 first is so that when a knight finally arrives here, white can't kick the knight by just simply pushing b4. It will at least take an a3 and then a b4, and then there's other sort of complications. So a3, queen d2, going ahead with this idea. I figured the other nice thing about a5 is it makes castling long for white just a little less palatable, I guess, because I'm already sort of partway into expanding on this side of the board. Arguably a6, b5 might have been better, but even so, this kind of works. And maybe this knight can even come here onto the b4 square. So seeing that I'm going to attack that pawn, he brings out his bishop. And then this is where I totally could have put the knight on c5 right away. I didn't like the idea of the bishop trading and then having this weird looking pawn structure. It turns out it's still fine. I think when I was calculating it, I thought that this was going to be a passed pawn, and I didn't like that. But of course, it's not a passed pawn because I still have my c pawn back on the 7th rank. So, whoops. So that would have been fine. But instead, I often play something like this so that if he trades on c5, then I can always keep a knight on that square. Plus, since the center is locked, I want to move that knight out of the way of the f pawn anyway. So it's kind of a multi-purpose move. And then he played knight f3, and now it seemed fairly clear that he was probably going to castle short, but I mean, he still hasn't committed to it. So what did I do next? I played my knight here, which is what I was going for. He played bishop back because he didn't want me to be able to trade off that bishop. And now this is the point where according to the engine and the database, I think I should have played f5 right away. I didn't do that because I wasn't quite sure how to handle the trades at this point. One downside of putting the knight here is then the bishop is blocked, so I can't recapture with the bishop if white takes. I could recapture with the rook, though, or even that pawn. But this would have been fine. Like, the position might have looked like this. I looked at a whole bunch of lines here, but I won't go through all of them. But in the case of something like this, white could play something like knight g5, and then I can just simply push, and that's pretty powerful. Something like this could be met with something like this, and then the bishop has to retreat, and black is doing pretty well. And there's a bunch of other ideas there, but I didn't push f5 because I still wasn't sure which way white was going to castle. So I played this waiting move, which I don't think was very good. It just kind of seems to solidify that knight in there. It maybe gives my bishop somewhere to go, actually. So you know, it's not a useless move, but f5 right away would have been better. Then white castled, and so I played f5. So I just played it maybe a move too late. But this right here is kind of what every King's Indian defense player wants. They want this locked center, and to get in this f5 push. f4 might be coming later, either right away or after a trade happens. And then we're going to sort of maneuver these knights over here to get into the attack. The bishop is over here. The queen can come over here. Obviously, don't hang your queen with the knight sitting there. But yeah, there's going to be expansion. There's going to be attacking over on this king side of the board. And so I was pretty happy in this position, actually. What does the engine say here? The engine says it's plus 0.1, 0.2. So white still has a little bit of an edge, but black has pretty much equalized here. I guess I let it run just a little bit longer, and now it says 0.0. So yeah, black is totally equalized. This is what black wants out of the King's Indian opening. So, White decided, my opponent decided, now is time to get rid of that bishop. I went ahead and pushed f4, pretty much forcing this now because the queen is cut off. So we trade. He pushes a3, looking to go b4, and then I pushed a4 because I felt like this disallows this push, so my knight isn't going to get kind of kicked around. The issue with this move is now this is a target, and he starts looking at attacking that target right away. And so there are 3 attackers on that pawn, and I actually played this move, knight f6, because now that my f pawn is pushed, I want to play knight f6 anyway. And the nice thing is it double attacks this pawn, and the pawn still has 2 defenders, but if either one of these defenders is used to capture my a pawn, then I'm just going to grab this one. So I felt like that was kind of a nice little defense. He defended by playing rook e1, and then I finally develop my last piece, my bishop, and also defend a4. So the engine really likes this position. It's like minus 1.4 here. So black is doing quite well in this sort of position. And yeah, this, as I said, this is kind of the position that a King's Indian player wants, like really having this great expansion on the king side. But now it's a matter of, okay, what do I do with this? How do I actually take this position and turn it into like an advantageous trade or winning material or something like this? So let's see how this game went. This is where I started getting a little bit confused, actually. So he played king h2. And I wasn't sure what the purpose of this move was. The purpose will become clear pretty soon, and I don't think it was a very sound idea, but I thought that he might be trying to push this g-pawn and kind of try to break things up over here a bit, which honestly I think would have been bad for white. Like, I think opening things up means that my rook gets active and this bishop is still active and my queen can come in if I can get rid of that knight. So I played knight h5 because I just felt like if that push ends up happening, then if a trade happens here, I guess I can't put a knight there, but if a trade happens here, then maybe I can put a knight on this square at some point. And it also opens up the rook, I suppose, but I think that was just kind of a waste of time. I think even here, I could have started trying to push my g-pawn and trying to get this g-pawn up here. I was worried about pushing it now because the knight could take. Yeah, but there's like this tactic that I missed. So if I pushed g5 and he takes with the knight, then I can actually go up here, right? Yeah, with a check. And then if takes, then takes. And of course, he's not going to take with the queen because then he's going to lose his queen because of that bishop. So I could have pushed the g-pawn right away. And if he takes, it's no good for him. And then if I manage to get my g-pawn pushed to g4, then he's in a lot of trouble. So that would have been a better move. I didn't see that. I didn't evaluate that properly. And so I played knight h5. And then this was his idea. He saw that I wanted to eventually push this g-pawn up the board. And so because the h-file was likely to open up, he wanted to put his rook on the h-file and then hide his king back on g1, which ended up not working out so well for him. I pushed my king back. He did as well. And then like I still prepared to push this g-pawn, but actually this g-pawn march down the board didn't actually end up happening, partly because he did this, but then this rook just ended up being kind of stuck here for most of the middle game. Knight e1, I got my knight back to f6 because, you know, h5 was a dumb square for it anyway. And then knight d3, and now this is where I also kind of miscalculated, and there's definitely a lesson to be learned here. I looked and said, okay, well, why doesn't that just win me a pawn? Like, I mean, I see that when there's a knight on that square, that this knight could, like, I don't know, move over there or something, and there'll be a discovered attack, but I can just move away from that that discovered attack, right? And it turns out that there's a pretty interesting idea from white here. So I calculated for a while, and then I said, I don't see why this isn't just a free pawn. And so we traded once, but then like I was looking at what this knight can do to like attack something. Like, of course, if this knight could have ended up here with a discovered attack, then it's attacking my queen, and that's more of an issue. But for some reason, I just totally overlooked that this knight can just take this pawn, right? Like, I don't know. It seems like when I have a nice pawn chain and everything's defended, I don't consider strongly enough, you know, a piece actually taking one of them, or if one of them is pinned or something like that. Like it's a bit of something that I don't see very well. So he captured there, and then it turns out this is still equal, or maybe even still a little bit better for black. Yeah, this is still better for black. If I find knight takes f2, which I'm gonna give that a double exclam. It's not really a brilliant, but the reason is because now I still managed to win a pawn. So this is a fork, and so white has to do something about it. White has to take here, and then I can take that knight. And now I am up a pawn. Yes, I'm up a pawn, and it's looking okay. Like, white still has lots of play. White can now bring the rook. This pawn is weak, and, you know, the game continues. But I did not see that. I just thought, okay, well, why don't I just take that knight, right? And this is where, like, a couple of things happened. First of all, I didn't actually realize for several moves that the material was equal. Like, when I took here, I captured on e4 and thought, there, I'm up a pawn. And so I kept thinking that I was up a pawn for several more moves, and you'll see kind of where I finally realized that that was not true. The other thing is, I hadn't calculated this line, and realizing how weak this e-pawn was going to be, right? It's a backwards pawn, meaning it's behind, you know, one of my other ones, and it's not being defended by another pawn, but it's also on a semi-open file. And so this pawn is going to be very easy for white to attack with a rook or a queen or something like that. Excuse me. And so that was what I missed, like, way back here when I thought, you know, this is a free pawn. It's not really a free pawn. It would have been if I then, you know, had grabbed that one. But in the end, we went through here and then takes my knight. And so now it is equal material. I'm still not realizing it yet, but it's equal material. And white is actually better. And white is better because this bishop is much better than it used to be. And it's potentially attacking this rook, actually, so I need to deal with that. And I have this weak d-pawn on the semi-open file. So, e-pawn rather, not d-pawn. But the weak pawn, the weak backwards pawn on that semi-open file. So I'm seeing this attack and seeing that this push is pretty strong, and so I tried to defend it like this. And actually, I totally had the wrong idea. My thought was that if white pushes, I can simply put my bishop here. And I labeled that as a blunder because my idea was not correct, but there is still actually a way out of it. It's not actually a blunder. I was just thinking, you know, if takes, then takes, right? And so I'm perfectly fine. But there's actually this. And that move is tricky because if I take, of course, I'm going to lose my queen. If I just kind of get out of the attack, then I'm going to lose my bishop and my knight is going to be under attack. Turns out that I'm still fine if I just play queen e6, and there's no problems. I'm defending. I can probably win that pawn at some point, actually maybe right away. I guess not if that happens. But anyway, it would have been fine, but instead of pushing that pawn, white just played here. And now I brought my rook over. Now the engine really likes the idea of putting the rook on a5 and then c5, which I considered during the game, but it seems kind of like a silly place for the rook. Like, it seems very passive, but the nice thing is it's putting constant pressure on this pawn. The pawn can't be protected by another pawn because I can just take it. And the rook right here can't ever be kicked. It's on a dark square and they only have a light squared bishop, and so nothing can remove the rook from that square. So this pressure is just going to be there forever. And actually, when my opponent and I, when we were looking over this game afterward, we talked about that, and it's kind of an interesting idea. But I moved over here just to defend this. And now, yeah, so now this is where I still thought that I was up a pawn. And so I just wanted to kind of break things up and maybe go after this pawn as well. Perhaps with this bishop also, if I can kind of break things up here. And even if I lose this pawn, that's okay, because I'm up a pawn, right? So I can afford to kind of break things up and try to open everything up and maybe simplify a little bit. But of course, I'm not up a pawn. The material is equal, and so actually, after this move, this pawn is just hanging. I'm going to lose it, and with a check as well, which I saw that, but I was okay with it. I thought that I would have enough compensation. I just simply moved my queen with the idea of putting a rook behind and kind of forcing white to take this pawn right away. I didn't want to take here because that just makes their bishop active. I wanted to force them to take so I could get my bishop active. So now we trade here, or he wins a pawn here, basically. And then we trade here, and I grab this file. So that was kind of an interesting set of exchanges. I had sort of calculated that all the way through. It went according to how I thought, and I liked this position because I felt like I could very easily get my rook active and maybe start to pick up some more pawns, along with, you know, this bishop being able to wrap around and win some others. So I liked the activity here. What I didn't realize until probably 2 moves after this is that I'm actually down a pawn now. And so I need to figure out how to get back into the game. He plays king f1 with the idea of just disallowing my rook to come here. I play the bishop up. I'm going to try to kick the king back. Counterattacking this pawn, kick the king back, and bring the rook here. I do lose my a pawn, but then I pick up the b pawn. And so now, of course, I'm looking at the board and it's like, oh, I am down a pawn. How did that happen? And so now kind of trying to figure out how to make this work. And I figured out that I can win a pawn back, and I can get the material back to being equal. Because he's going to take a couple of moves to get this rook back into play. And right now, if I play actively and quickly, I can, take advantage of the fact that rook is basically not in the game. So I attacked that pawn. I considered going over here first and forcing that and then attacking this pawn. I'm not sure if that is any better, but I decided just to go for this pawn immediately. So I did. And then finally he gets his rook back out, and he's defending this pawn as well. Now, this may not have been the right choice, but I moved my rook to a4 and then down to a6. This is incredibly passive, a very passive place for this rook to be, but it is causing some pressure and defending this pawn. And according to the engine, this is a draw. This endgame is absolutely a draw. But it's only a draw if both sides know how to play it correctly. And so white starts bringing their king. I start bringing my king. And then this is where I made my first mistake. For some reason, I thought that my king was going to be quick enough to get up and defend everything, but it's not. White can just simply come in on g4, and now I'm actually in trouble. This pawn is in trouble, and my king is blocked out. So the best move here would have actually been h5. And then I just completely blocked this king from making any more progress, and I should have been able to hold this position. But once I did this, white starts getting an edge. Now I can't hold on to that pawn as well as these ones. So then I tried sort of this a desperado idea. I'm not sure why I decided that this would be a good thing to do, but I moved my king over here. I tried to really calculate this. I knew that this meant that he was going to go down here and gobble up these pawns, but I was sort of gambling on this idea that maybe I can get my king over here quickly enough to win this pawn and push that rook away and manage to get this pawn up the board somehow. I was wrong. That is not a possible thing right here, but this is what I tried. So over I go. And, of course, this is a very good move. He starts picking up my pawns. I grab his. And now, this is looking pretty bad at this point. White is definitely winning. Yeah, it's like +3, +3.5, something like that. There are 3 pawns over here, but my pawn is more advanced, and I am going to try to take advantage of that as much as I possibly can. And then he actually threw away all of the advantage, and this is a draw again. And I'll show you the reason. First of all, I get my rook in, and then I keep pushing that pawn. He gives a check, and I figure if he is going to try to get behind this pawn or deliver checks, I'm just going to block with the rook. I am perfectly okay if he wants to trade rooks here, because this pawn is going to promote very quickly. And then he moves over here. I continue pushing, so he has to move the rook way back here to defend against promotion. And now, if I can get my rook onto the second rank, then I can maybe pick up one or both of those pawns. And then if I can get my rook here, then I might be able to just simply promote, especially if my king manages to walk up this way. So the best move here is king b4, because it allows me immediately to get my rook onto one of those two really nice squares. But in the moment, I was like, all right, I want to get my rook like there. So I'm going to move it over so that the king isn't in the way. So I can go up here and then maybe move over and then back up. And I don't know, like, I think it was sort of this idea that I'm thinking about my rook and thinking about where I want my rook. And so I'm thinking about how I can maneuver my rook to where I want it to be. But I can actually do it by just, moving another piece out of its way. So that was just kind of a really silly miscalculation. If I had found this move, then once again, it's a draw. And it's actually pretty interesting because after something like this, then I can just start delivering checks to this king until the king maybe has to go hide somewhere a little less active. And there are a bunch of different lines, but one that I thought was interesting is if the king comes over here to try to attack my rook and prevent checks, now I can go up here and I'm going to win one or both of these pawns like this. And then white can start trying to move the pawns down the board, but I'm going to bring my king up here and threaten this rook. And one thing I was evaluating, earlier in the game is at some point, especially when white had 3 pawns over here, white can probably sacrifice the rook and still be okay because these pawns are going to promote. But in this position, they can't, because at this point, my king can actually get involved and my rook can get involved fast enough that I can draw against these 2 pawns. Because it's going to take me 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say 4 moves to get my king involved, and then 1 move for my rook to go either here or here. So that's 5 moves, whereas white is going to take 2 moves for the king to get involved, and then 3 more moves is going to just get the pawns onto the 6th rank, and that's not far enough. So I'm actually going to get my pieces involved in the defense quicker than white can get all the way to the promotion square. So this is actually a draw, amazingly enough. But, of course, I played this, and it's just 1 move too slow. And now white is going to start pushing the pawns. White can actually lose this pawn, and I probably could have taken this one right away. But I think white is still perfectly fine if I do that. I decided to go here because I wanted to do this little trick to try to promote. White goes here. I take that pawn finally. And now there's nothing I can do to stop these pawns from promoting. So white is just marching them down the board. I'm bringing my king up this way to try to get rid of this rook. Finally, he sacrifices the rook. But now there's nothing I can do. On the next move, white is going to promote. And I'm going to have to sacrifice my rook, and my king is too far away to stop this pawn. And so in this position, I resigned, which it was quite the game. And I'm really happy with how well I played against someone with such strength. Like I had a really good position out of the opening. And then even in the end game, I had some serious drawing chances. And it kind of solidifies this idea for me that the end game is probably, I don't know if I'll say the weakest part of my game, but it's definitely one of the areas that I need to work on the most. And since this tournament, I have been working on my end games quite a bit more. So a couple interesting little lessons here. If we go back to move 22, this whole sequence of calculating, I think I mentioned this in a previous video from a recap from this tournament. I'm used to tactics puzzles, and so doing calculations and figuring out like material or checkmate threats or those sorts of things. And I need to get used to situations like this where a series of exchanges happens, and then I need to evaluate the position. Am I better in this position that results from these exchanges, or am I not better? And that's definitely something that I struggled with here. And the key idea is I'm not going to win a pawn because white can tactically win this pawn. And I'm going to have, in the end, this backwards pawn because of because of how it all goes. I'm going to have this backwards pawn on the semi-open file, and it's going to be very hard to hold on to that. So things like that are things I need to be able to see when I'm in calculation mode way back here, so I can make the correct decisions. And then the other one, of course, as I mentioned, I just need to work on my endgame. So there are a couple of moves. This one is just a no-brainer, right? I should totally be able to find just pushing h5 and keeping that king out, and that would have been a much nicer position for me. Like there are still some challenges, but it would have kept the game going for sure. And then on move 55 here, yeah, like I said, just like, I don't need to maneuver the rook around the king. I can just move the king out of the way. So little things like that, I think, are things that I'm going to pick up with experience and by, making mistakes like this in these sorts of serious games. And hopefully I won't make the exact same mistake again next time I'm in this sort of position. And again, I'll be doing a lot more endgame study at this point, and I already have been. I'll be making some videos about some of that and some of the things I've been learning. So stay tuned for that. So that is it for round 3. Round 4 is coming soon. Round 3 was a very fun game. It's always nice to play against a higher rated opponent. I feel like I can learn so much from doing that. So if you're interested in checking out other games from this tournament, the playlist is right over here, and I will have round 4 and 5 coming out very soon. If you're watching this shortly after I put it out, those ones might be out in the next couple of days. And thank you so much for watching. If you learned something or if you liked this video, please do hit the like button. It's super helpful, and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. And I will see you on the next one.